What if Jesus was never born? 2.4 billion people wake up every morning following a moral code written 2,000 years ago by a group with no army, no government, no political power. 1 in 3 humans alive right now, and it all traces back to a single birth that Rome never officially recorded. No census entry, no imperial document. A child born in an occupied territory in a province so insignificant that the governor of Syria outranked its administrator. The kind of birth that leaves no trace in the archives of the most sophisticated bureaucratic empire the ancient world had ever produced. Now remove that birth entirely. Not the religion, not the church, not the theology, just the birth. One child who never arrives. What disappears with him is not what you expect. Not just churches, not just Christmas. The calendar on your phone, gone. The word goodbye, gone. The hospital nearest to you, its entire conceptual origin erased. The university system that produced every doctor, engineer, and lawyer you have ever interacted with, its founding logic, dissolved. 45,000 distinct religious denominations, 160 nations whose legal frameworks carry the imprint of a moral tradition. Started by 12 people with no credentials. A civilization that calls its own history before Christ and after Christ, as if a single human life was the only axis worth measuring time from. All of it, from one birth that almost no one in power noticed. So what happens to the world if that birth never comes? The first things to go are the ones hiding in plain sight. January 1st means nothing without the Gregorian calendar. Itself a reform of the Julian system, driven by the need to correctly calculate Easter. No Jesus means no Easter, means no reason to fix the calendar in 1582. The world keeps running on a patchwork of competing systems. The Roman calendar, the Hebrew calendar, the various lunar systems across Asia and the Middle East. Global trade in the modern sense, which depends on synchronized dates, synchronized contracts, synchronized markets, becomes a coordination problem that takes centuries longer to solve. The word goodbye vanishes from English. It contracts from God be with ye, a Christianized farewell that entered common speech in the 16th century. Christmas obviously disappears, but so does Easter, chapel, cardinal, and grace in its moral sense. Linguists estimate that thousands of words and phrases in English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Mintu, and German carry direct roots in Christian theology or Church Latin. The vocabulary of forgiveness, salvation, charity, and compassion in their current moral weight, all shaped by 2,000 years of Christianized usage, shifts in meaning or disappears entirely. The music changes beyond recognition. Johann Sebastian Bach wrote over 1,000 compositions, the majority for Lutheran church services. He considered himself, in his own words, writing for the glory of God. No church, no Bach. And Bach is not a footnote. He is the structural foundation on which Beethoven and Brahms built. Remove him, and you do not just lose 220 cantatas, you lose the harmonic language that defined what music could be in the Western world for 300 years. The skyline of every major European city looks unrecognizable. No Gothic cathedrals, those engineering experiments in stone and light that pushed the limits of medieval architecture and gave builders the techniques that eventually fed into the Renaissance. Notre Dame de Paris, Cologne Cathedral, Canterbury, Chartres, not just gone as buildings, but gone as the problem that forced human ingenuity forward. The flying buttress, the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, structural innovations born from the question of how to build higher toward heaven with no heaven to aim for, never get asked. And the hospitals, the first institution in Western history that took in sick strangers, not family members, not paying patients, not soldiers, and treated them regardless of their ability to pay, was the Basileus, founded in Caesarea in 369 after the Common Era by Basil of Caesarea explicitly as an act of Christian charity. The concept that a society owes medical care to its poorest members is not a secular invention. It is a theological one. Without that theological foundation, the hospital as a public institution does not emerge from Rome, does not spread through medieval Europe, and does not become the default model that modern healthcare inherits. All of it, the calendar, the vocabulary, the music, the architecture, the hospital, gone before a single army has moved or a single border has changed. In the year 312 after the Common Era, a Roman emperor named Constantine saw, or claimed to see, a vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. He won, he converted, and the most powerful political institution in the ancient world became Christian. Without Jesus, that moment never happens. Constantine still fights. Constantine still wins or loses. But there is no Christianity for him to convert to, no cross to paint on his soldiers' shields, no theological framework to wrap imperial power inside. The Roman Empire continues its existing trajectory, a system held together by military force, administrative efficiency, and a polytheistic religious culture that tolerated local gods as long as taxes were paid. That empire was already fracturing. Without Christianity as a unifying cultural identity across its territories, the fracture lines deepen faster. The western half, already losing economic ground to the east, has no shared moral language to slow the centrifugal pull of regional identities. The Germanic tribes moving across the Rhine and Danube frontiers are not converting to a faith that does not exist. There is no church to preserve Latin literacy through the collapse, no monasteries copying manuscripts through the dark centuries, no papal structure providing a thin thread of institutional continuity across a broken landscape. Western Europe does not have a dark age. It has something worse, a fragmentation with no recovery mechanism. Meanwhile, the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century produces Muhammad, but into a completely different world. Islam emerges, as it historically did, Buddha, partly in conversation with and reaction to existing Jewish and Christian traditions. Without Christianity shaping the theological vocabulary of the region for 600 years, Islam develops differently, not necessarily weaker, but differently structured, aimed at a different set of questions, expanding into a power vacuum in Europe that is far more chaotic and far less organized than the one it historically encountered. By the year 1000 after the Common Era, the map is unrecognizable. No Holy Roman Empire, no papal states, no crusades. Which means also none of the transmission of Greek philosophical texts back into Europe that the Crusades inadvertently facilitated. The universities of Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, all founded under church authority, do not exist. The concept of a university, a permanent institution dedicated to preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations, has no organizational sponsor in Europe powerful enough to sustain it. The Americas get colonized, eventually, but not by Catholic Spain and Portugal, following a papal line dividing the New World between them, not under the theological justification of saving souls. The colonization that comes leaded is driven purely by trade economics, and it is brutal in different ways, by different powers, with different long-term consequences, for which languages, dunamai, which legal systems, and which cultural assumptions take root across 2 continents. Every border you know, every language dominant in a region you can name, every legal tradition underlying a modern democracy, redrawn, replaced, or simply absent. Paul of Tarsus is born around the year 5 after the Common Era in what is now southern Turkey. He is educated, multilingual, a Roman citizen, placavi, and a zealous enforcer of Jewish law. Historically, he spends years persecuting Mitzman, the early followers of Jesus, then has a vision on the road to Damascus, converts, and becomes the most consequential writer in the history of Western thought. Without Jesus, Paul has nothing to convert to. He lives out his life as a Pharisee, educated, capable, probably influential within Jewish legal circles in the Eastern Mediterranean. He writes nothing that survives, He starts no movement. He takes no letters. To Rome, to Corinth, to the Galatians. And with him disappears something that almost no one accounts for. When they think about this question, the first systematic attempt to translate a Jewish theological tradition into Greek philosophical language. Paul's letters are not just religious documents. They are the bridge between Hebrew moral thought and Greek rational structure. That bridge is what allowed Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century to synthesize Christian theology with Platonic philosophy, producing the intellectual framework that dominated European thought for 1,000 years. No Paul means no bridge. No bridge means Augustine builds something different or nothing at all. No Augustine means no Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century took Augustine's synthesis and rebuilt it using Aristotle, the Greek texts that had been preserved in Arabic translation and reintroduced to Europe through Islamic scholarship. That synthesis became scholasticism, the method of rigorous logical inquiry applied to theological questions. Scholasticism is the direct intellectual ancestor of the scientific method, the habit of forming a question, marshalling evidence, testing against counterargument, and reaching a provisional conclusion. That cognitive structure was trained into European thinkers through centuries of theological debate. Remove Paul, lose the bridge, lose Augustine, lose Aquinas, lose scholasticism, and then trace what is missing downstream. René Descartes, trained by Jesuits, builds his philosophy of mind in explicit dialogue with theological questions about the soul. Immanuel Kant structures his moral philosophy around the question of what replaces divine command as the basis for ethics. Blaise Pascal, Isaac Newton, Gottfried Leibniz, all working at the intersection of faith and reason, all producing their mathematics and physics partly as attempts to understand a universe they believed was rationally ordered because a rational God had designed it. The assumption that the universe is comprehensible, that it follows laws, that those laws are discoverable by human reason, that the effort of discovery is worthwhile, is not a neutral scientific assumption. It is a theological inheritance. And without the chain that runs from Jesus to Paul, to Augustine, to Aquinas, to the universities, to the scientific revolution, that assumption does not arrive in European thought. On the same timeline, in the same form, with the same force. The butterfly here is not a religion. It is a habit of mind. One child never born. One conversion never happens. One set of letters never written. And the cognitive architecture of modern science arrives later, weaker, or from a completely different direction. Florence Nightingale was born in 1820 into a wealthy English family that named her after the Italian city where she came into the world. She was brilliant, mathematically gifted, and could have lived the comfortable life her social class prescribed. She chose, instead, to reform military hospitals during the Crimean War, reducing death rates in the British barracks hospital at Scutari from 42% to 2% in a single winter through sanitation and systematic record-keeping. She did it because she believed, explicitly and in her own written words, that it was God's work, that caring for the sick body was a form of worship, that the hospital was a moral institution before it was a medical one. Without that theological conviction, without 2,000 years of Christian tradition, telling her that the suffering stranger had infinite worth, Florence Nightingale is a brilliant woman who does something else entirely. Modern nursing as a profession and the data-driven approach to hospital administration that she pioneered either does not emerge from her hands or emerges from someone else's, somewhere else, decades later. Gregor Mendel was an Augustinian friar in Brno, in what is now the Czech Republic. Between 1856 and 1863, he grew and tested 28,000 pea plants in the monastery garden, tracking inherited traits across generations. He discovered the laws of genetic inheritance. He published in 1866. Almost no one read it. His work was rediscovered in 1900 and became the foundation of modern genetics. and from genetics, the foundation of molecular biology. And from molecular biology, every cancer treatment, every vaccine platform, every gene therapy being developed right now. He had the time, the space, the institutional support, and the intellectual formation to do that work, because he was a monk in a monastery. The monastery existed because the church existed. The church existed because of a chain that begins in Bethlehem. Georges Lemaitre was a Belgian Catholic priest and physicist who in 1927 proposed that the universe was expanding, and in 1931 suggested that if you ran that expansion backward, everything traced to a single point of origin. He called it the hypothesis of the primeval atom. Others called it, mockingly at first, the Big Bang. The man who gave us the conceptual origin of the universe was a priest who saw no contradiction between his faith and his physics. When Einstein initially resisted his math, Lemaitre pushed back. When Pope Pius XII tried to claim the Big Bang as scientific proof of Genesis, Lemaitre quietly asked him to stop, because he kept his theology and his science in separate rooms, and he was careful about which door he opened in public. Without the institutional church that trained him, housed him, and gave him the freedom to think, Lemaitre is perhaps a schoolteacher in Charleroi. The Big Bang theory gets proposed by someone else, possibly later, possibly from a different starting assumption entirely. These three people, a nurse, a monk, a priest, gave the modern world its model of healthcare, its understanding of heredity, and its theory of cosmic origin. All three were shaped, directly and personally, by a tradition that begins with one birth in an unremarkable town in an occupied territory at the edge of a dying empire. Remove the birth, and you do not just lose the religion, you lose the specific humans who, because of that religion, were in the right place. Bikateo? With the right formation, asking the right questions at the right moment. History does not automatically produce substitutes. It produces what the conditions allow, and the conditions in each of these cases were theological. The birth that Rome never recorded changed the count of every year that came after it, not metaphorically, literally. The number on your phone right now, the year, the date, the invisible grid that organizes every meeting, every deadline, every birthday, runs on a system built around a single life as its fixed point, before and after. Everything measured from one direction or the other. That is an extraordinary thing to do to time. To say, here, this moment, this person, this is the axis. And it was done not by an emperor, not by a philosopher with an academy, not by a general with 100,000 soldiers. It was done by someone who wrote nothing, commanded nothing, and died with nothing. The question this leaves open is not about Jesus. It is about scale and invisibility. The people building the next axis, the next fixed point that future centuries will organize themselves around, are probably not famous right now. They are probably working in obscurity, in institutions that seem marginal, asking questions that seem impractical. The way Mendel was, the way Lemaitre was, the way a child in an unrecorded birth in an unremarkable province was. What gets built from nothing by no one is sometimes everything. The world you are living in right now is the answer to a birth 2,000 years ago. The question worth sitting with is, whose birth, happening somewhere unrecorded right now, is the world 2,000 years from now the answer to be?